Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Lori Marie Pashota, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mental Health Association of Rhode Island. Thank you for joining our policy briefing today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Beth Lamar. I'm the Executive Director at NAMI Rhode Island. And each year, MHARI and NAMI Rhode Island represent mental health consumers and team up to talk about the policy priorities that are relevant to our membership.
Thanks, Beth. Now I'll share my screen because we have a brief presentation for all of you. I hope everyone can see this. Okay. So welcome. Mental Health Association was founded over 100 years ago by a gentleman named Clifford Beers. Mr. Beers was a Yale graduate and a Wall Street banker, and for much of his adult life, he lived with serious, persistent mental illness. He spent a considerable amount of time in asylums. That's what psychiatric hospitals were known as back then, asylums. And the conditions in those asylums were horrific. He wrote an autobiography called A Mind That Found Itself, and it chronicled his time in these asylums. Physicians across the country read his book, and they joined Mr. Beers in a national reform movement. He helped pass laws to protect the interests of patients who are in psychiatric institutions, and he also passed laws that require therapeutic standards of care for institutions. This hits really close to home. Mr. Beers actually spent the last few years of his life at Butler Hospital, where he died of natural causes. Even back then, Butler Hospital was known as a very reputable, forward-thinking institution. But that is a connection that we hold very dear at the Mental Health Association. Today, the Mental Health Association of Rhode Island improves our system of care in Rhode Island through advocacy, education, policy development, and non-clinical research. Our priority areas are increasing access to care, diversity, equity, and inclusion, reforming the criminal legal system, workforce development, and establishing an Olmstead plan in Rhode Island. And I do this work following in Mr. Beers' footsteps. I identify as someone who also has lived experience with mental health challenges.
So NAMI started back in 1979 as a small group of families sitting around a kitchen table, trying to build better resources and systems for their loved ones who are living with mental health conditions. That movement has expanded into a network of more than 600 affiliates across the US today. NAMI RI is the state organization of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization dedicated to building better lives for the millions of Americans who are impacted by mental illness. In Rhode Island, we offer education, support, and advocacy programs statewide and virtually to support this mission. The main priority areas of NAMI include improved systems and access, youth and preventive mental health, safe and appropriate crisis response, community inclusion and non-discrimination in all its forms, and the stopping of harmful practices that worsen mental health conditions.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you. For today's presentation, we are going to focus on 4 priority areas where we would like to see change in 2023. Those priorities include rebuilding our behavioral health care system, youth mental health, ending the criminalization of mental illness, and preventive measures. Lori is going to start us off now by speaking about how we can rebuild the behavioral health system in Rhode Island.
Thanks, Beth. So I think we all know that we have a problem in Rhode Island. Rhode Islanders are not able to access treatment and services when we need it. There are wait lists across all levels of care. People we know are being prematurely discharged from hospitals, and often without a warm handoff to those transitional levels of care, like partial hospitalization or intensive outpatient programs. Yes, the pandemic did increase staff burnout, and yes, the pandemic did increase demand for services, But these wait lists existed prior to 2020. In fact, in 2018, I tried to find an outpatient therapist and I had to go on a wait list. So that was 2 years before the pandemic. Wait lists are caused in part by insurance companies and Medicaid paying mental and behavioral health professionals poor rates. And this means that many providers choose to work in Connecticut or Massachusetts where the rates are higher, so they leave our network. If they do stay in Rhode Island, they often do not accept Medicaid, and many are choosing not to accept any insurance at all because the reimbursement rates do not cover the costs of actually providing the treatment and services. The state is not invested in building a full continuum of care in Rhode Island. And as I said, we don't have enough of those transitional levels of care that are really important to someone's recovery. Because if one is being discharged from an inpatient hospital, residential treatment facility, we need to have a step down level of care before we go back into our everyday lives. It's really a critical time in a person's recovery. And in my own personal experience, with an eating disorder, I needed all those levels of care. I needed residential treatment, I needed partial hospitalization, and then intensive outpatient services, and then 15 months of outpatient therapy. And I do this work because I know not everyone is as lucky as me to have all of that treatment and care when they need it. It's important that we rebuild our continuum of care, and that starts by building a robust outpatient system. So House Bill 5657, sponsored by Representative Tansey, and Senate Bill 579 require commercial insurance and companies to provide a one-time rate increase for outpatient therapy and diagnostic services. So it's limited. To bring them up to the inflationary adjustment rate plus 5 percentage points. It's a one-time increase. We're looking at it as a stopgap measure until the Office of Health Insurance Commissioner can release its rate review report later this fall. But we know that many providers are struggling to either stay in business or stay in insurance networks. Providers need a meaningful increase. It can't just be, 50 cents or $1 here or $1 there for rates. It really needs to be meaningful and making up for lost time. We also support a piece of legislation that would ask the state to invest $200 million into our continuum of care. This is sponsored on the House side by Rep. Casimiro, and on the Senate side, Senator Louis DePalma, and we'll support all measures to increase access to treatment for Rhode Islanders. This is one of them. Last year, our leaders allocated state funding to establish certified community behavioral health clinics, or as we call them, CCBHCs. And CCBHCs are important. They're based on a federal model that integrates primary care and behavioral health care. They accept anyone who walks through their doors, regardless of type of insurance or ability to pay. They collaborate with local law enforcement to prevent people with serious persistent mental illness from becoming incarcerated. And what's really revolutionary about this federal model is that it uses a prospective payment method to pay the clinics for their services, for their expertise. And that will help these clinics to stay financially healthy for the long term so that Rhode Islanders have access to those clinics when they need them. And this year, we're calling on our leaders to approve what's in Governor McKee's proposed state budget, to approve that additional state funding so that we can fully, correctly implement the CCBHC model in Rhode Island. Lastly, an important measure would be to establish an Olmstead plan in Rhode Island. Olmstead refers to a 1999 United States Supreme Court case that affirmed states' legal obligations to ensure that people who are at risk of unnecessary institutionalization including people with disabilities, that they have everything they need to avoid that institutionalization if they can. The court ruled that people have a right to live, work, and receive services in the least restrictive setting of their choosing. And when these rights are not ensured, when these rights are violated, it's considered a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the states who want to demonstrate a good faith effort to comply with the ADA, they'll often develop plans. Often they call them Olmstead plans. And these plans serve as a roadmap for how a state will assess the supply and demand of services and resources, put funding streams into place, and secure those resources for the long term for the people who need them now and people who will need them in the future. Things like supportive housing, affordable housing, home care services, transportation, educational supports. Right now, Rhode Island is one of 6 or 7 states that doesn't have any type of a plan to coordinate and do this kind of work to ensure that people's rights are not being violated. We were thrilled that last summer, Governor McKee announced that his administration would be establishing an Olmstead Planning Committee. And they did begin that work, but it's been put on pause because of widespread staffing shortages at the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. They don't have the funding right now to hire someone to do this work, and there aren't enough people working at the EOHHS to do this work. This piece of legislation would put some of the control into the General Assembly's hands and allow the General Assembly to form a planning committee and finally launch this work and move it forward. We feel this is an important part of having a robust system of care that can pivot to changes in supply and demand and be responsive to crises like the pandemic. Now, Beth will talk about our second priority, youth mental health.
Thank you, Lori. Rhode Island is experiencing an ongoing mental health crisis, which is echoing the national emergency. Some of the problems include the continued shortage of youth mental health providers and services throughout Rhode Island. So over the last decade, the rates of mental health diagnoses and suicidality have risen steadily, but there's not a congruent rise in the number of psychiatric clinicians, namely for youth services, per an article about a year ago from the Providence Journal. In fact, there's actually been a continued shortage of providers and services. In Rhode Island, suicide is the second leading cause of death in youth ages 15 to 24, outnumbered only by auto accidents. Some youth face adverse childhood experiences referred to as ACEs, which are factors that can be potentially traumatic and with lifelong impact. These experiences include abuse, neglect, poverty, family separation, community violence, racism, and discrimination. Recent studies indicate that a broad range of ACEs are significant risk factors for most mental health problems, including psychosis. These experiences may have begun or become heightened for many youth during the pandemic. And additionally, the lingering effects of the pandemic, such as economic impacts for families and communities, periods of illness and isolation, educational and developmental setbacks, grief and loss over people or experiences, and other factors are going to continue to impact our youth for years to come. Some causes that have led to these issues include the increased demand and risk factors on an already strained youth system of care, inadequate insurance networks of providers, and free care for those who are uninsured, underinsured, or who cannot afford the out-of-pocket expenses associated with getting care, a lack of youth-specific services and staffing shortages, and the reliance on school counselors as the sole providers of youth mental health service. So one solution is the implementation of mental health days for students in the House. This is Bill 6234, led by Rep. Kislak. And this bill would allow all Rhode Island students to take up to 4 mental health days for mental or behavioral health concerns as excused absences. 1 in 6 youth aged 6 through 17 experience a mental health condition such as anxiety, depression, or serious mental illness each year. Other students may not have a mental health condition, but may have challenging days or weeks when their mental health is suffering. Passing this bill would give students the peace of mind to know that they can take these mental health days from school without fear of repercussion and get the rest of the services that they need for their health and their best school performance. Another solution is mental health curriculum. In the House, this is Bill 5084, led by Rep. Lombardi. This bill requires the Rhode Island Department of Education to develop and make available curriculum for 4 hours of mental health instruction for all 7th graders. One benefit of this bill would be education as a tool for prevention, teaching students how and when to seek help for themselves or those they care about, while decreasing the stigma that's associated with talking about mental health. Another important point is that this bill can assist schools or districts in providing the mental health education that's needed when they otherwise might not be able to afford to create or purchase some necessary curriculum. A third solution is the implementation of the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights. In the House, this is Bill 5499, led by Rep. O'Brien, and this bill would create the Anti-Bullying Bill of Rights Act, which would strengthen protection for students in schools who might be victims of bullying. This bill also requires more enhanced school staff training in order to combat the effects of bullying and provide a collaboration between the Department of Ed, the Attorney General, and state police to establish policies and procedures around how to handle bullying incidents. The passing of this bill would decrease the incidence rate of bullying, which of course can impact students' mental health negatively. But another possible benefit is that some students who might become bullies of others are doing so as an outlet for negative feelings or as learned behavior as victims themselves. So the anti-bullying measures may encourage those students to seek outlets for their emotions or the supports that are needed, in addition to protecting the students who might be threatened or become victims of bullying. And then the last solution that we are focusing on is the increased number of school mental health professionals. In the House, this is Bill 5010, led by Rep. McNamara, and in the Senate, it is Bill 869, led by Senator Cano. And these bills aim to promote access to increased mental health services for all students, requiring that those services covered by school social workers and school psychologists be eligible for federal Medicaid reimbursement. This bill is what we call a no-brainer, because if students have access to mental health services that they need at school, they're more likely to use those services. And for many, this might be the only access they have to mental health services at all. Back to you, Lori.
Thanks, Beth. So now let's talk about our third priority, which is ending the criminalization of mental illness. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Serious persistent mental illness is defined as a mental illness that impairs activities of daily living and requires long-term treatment. About 7% of Rhode Islanders live with serious persistent mental illness, or SPMI, but compare that to our prison population, where 15 to 20% of our inmates live with SPMI. So like many states across the country, Rhode Island's largest psychiatric institution in effect is our prison system, housing more people with SPMI than psychiatric facilities and long-term care facilities. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is this? Well, part of the reason is because states, including Rhode Island, have not invested enough resources into developing supportive and supervised housing and services for people with SPMI. Often the severity of their illnesses make it unlikely that they can, for example, maintain employment or maintain housing or maintain food security. And so often they end up trying to fend for themselves without support from the state. They often end up becoming homeless. And once they're homeless, they often commit crimes related to homelessness, for example, shoplifting food, sleeping in a public area. And then they have, after the arrest, they're incarcerated. And so that is why 15 to 20% of our inmate population are individuals living with SPMI. One thing we can do to perhaps help curtail the recidivism rate is to reform how we do Medicaid for inmates who are being discharged back into the community. So currently, when a person enters the prison system, they lose Medicaid. They lose whatever health insurance they had going into prison because the state has to cover 100% of the costs of their medical and mental and behavioral health care. That falls to the state. So they enter prison, the Medicaid is deactivated, they're in prison for however long, and then once they are being discharged back into the community upon release from prison, they often have not reactivated their Medicaid yet. It takes time for Medicaid to reactivate once you've closed a case. And so these individuals are going into the community. Maybe they have a 30-day supply of medication that the prison gave them, but they certainly don't have timely access to treatment and services and supportive housing. They're just kind of being discharged. And, there are organizations who try to help smooth that process with case management services, but the Medicaid is something that seems like it should be an easy enough fix. And so this piece of legislation would do that fix. It would require the Department of Corrections to begin the process of activating their Medicaid with the Executive Office of Health and Human Services in Rhode Island at least 30 days prior to an inmate's release. And again, that's so that they can have a smoother transition back into their communities and have immediate access to treatment and services without a gap. And this will help, hopefully, reduce the likelihood of the person again becoming homeless and again having contact with law enforcement and again entering the prison system. So this is one measure that we can look to hopefully reduce the recidivism rate. Another issue that's really important for NAMI and MHARI is to look at our solitary confinement practices. So in Rhode Island, our prison system calls solitary confinement segregated housing, and persons who are in segregated housing are allowed out of their small cells 1 hour per day. So they spend 23 hours in a very small cell, probably smaller than your bedroom at home. If you're an inmate, you often refer to solitary confinement as the whole, and that should tell us something. The psychological harm caused by solitary confinement has been well documented. As one psychologist and National Academy of Sciences committee member noted at a public hearing, quote, as a result of the endless monotony and lack of human contact, for some prisoners, solitary confinement precipitates a descent into madness, Many inmates experience panic attacks, depression, paranoia, and some suffer from hallucinations, end quote. And these effects last long after this inmate has been released back into the community. The same psychologist goes on to say, quote, one of the very serious psychological consequences of solitary confinement is that it renders many people incapable of living anywhere else. When these prisoners are released into cells or back into their society, they are often overwhelmed with anxiety. They actually get to the point where they become frightened of other human beings, he said. So inmates with serious persistent mental illness are more likely to have difficulty following prison rules because of the nature of their illnesses, and they're more likely to be disciplined with solitary confinement. We know that inmates with SPMI are more likely to die by suicide in prison. And we also know that segregated housing is not used only for violent inmates. It's also used, quote, to protect inmates with SPMI for their own good, to protect them because it's recognized that the nature of their illnesses make them vulnerable to being victimized by other inmates. And so this piece of legislation seeks to provide oversight and to put limits on when and how solitary confinement can be used in our prison system. If you don't mind salty language, John Oliver has a video on YouTube where he takes a deep dive into solitary confinement, and he has a great conversation with a former inmate who spent a while in solitary confinement, and he talks very openly about what he experienced during that confinement and then once he was released from prison. It's really moving and powerful. And now Beth will talk about some preventive measures that we are following.
Thank you. So this is our final priority area that we're focusing on. And there are 2 preventive measures that we're looking at up for legislation this year. Laura, would you just advance one? Thank you. So one preventive measure that we can take is safety nets on bridges. And in the House, this is legislation 6002, led by Rep. Solomon. In the Senate, it is 568, led by Senator DePalma. And this bill would mandate that the Rhode Island Turnpike and Bridge Authority design and implement safety barriers or netting systems on the Mount Hope Bridge, Claiborne Pell Bridge, and Jamestown Verrazano Bridge. So there is 1 death by suicide every 3 days in Rhode Island. And of course, there are many more people who experience thoughts of suicide. Suicidal thinking, though, is oftentimes short-lived. So if a suicide attempt can be prevented in the moment of crisis, these barriers can certainly help to save lives. As an example, those who attempted suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge and were stopped by a person did not go on to die by suicide by other means. So while the implementation of bridge safety systems may be a large expense to the state, the most important thing to remember is this is an opportunity for the state to invest in saving lives, and a one-time cost would have lasting benefits for years to come. Another preventive system that we're looking at is the sustainability funding for the 988 crisis phone line system. The legislation for this is House Bill 6121, led by Rep. Shallcross Smith, and Senate 561, which is led by Senator Cano. These bills would ensure appropriations from the state's budget to create and sustain the 988 crisis line. Since its implementation, 988 has been well received and an acclaimed service for helping those who are in crisis. Some of the main benefits of the new 988 system are when you call, you reach a support who is also located in Rhode Island, familiar with the system, the area, the navigation, the geography, and also having a memorable number to call in an emergency. Funding for 988 would keep continuity of this invaluable service. The main opposition to this sustainability plan is the concern that phone service providers, and then by association their customers, would be opposed to paying an additional fee on their monthly bills, which would help to contribute to the revolving fund for sustainability. However, all phone customers are already paying a 911 system fee on their bill, and 988 is no different from 911 in that it's an indispensable resource for emergencies and therefore is no less important.
In summary, we respectfully encourage our leaders to make greater investments in our mental and behavioral health care system. Immediate access to services improves patient outcomes, saves lives, and saves money. When patients access treatment in a timely fashion, their conditions improve or even stabilize. And this decreases the overutilization rate of emergency departments, hospitals, residential treatment facilities, all very expensive levels of care. When Rhode Islanders with SPMI have access to stable and supportive housing and community services, the rates of arrest and incarceration decrease, and we reduce the overall utilization of law enforcement and courts and jails and prison. And that also saves money. But doing nothing is never free. We simply pay the price later. Most importantly, I believe our neglect dehumanizes Rhode Islanders with disabilities. We are good people with big hearts, and I know we can do better. This is a photo from last year's May is Mental Health Month event at the State House. I'm showing you this photo because I particularly love that pink sign that says spending equals values, because it's really true. And while there are many worthy priorities competing for the same state funding dollars, I submit that mental health should be prioritized. There is no health without mental health. We can't do well in school if we don't have mental health. We can't perform at our jobs if we don't have mental health. We can't make good decisions as leaders if we don't have mental health. And mental health is the foundation of everything good in our lives. And I submit that we all have a stake in this fight.
So what can you all do? For the legislators or their staff who might be in the audience, we would like to see you all support these bills if you're not doing so already. Let all of us as community advocates know how we can work together to make those bills come to fruition. You can stay informed with MHARI and NAMI Rhode Island through our newsletters and social media. And you can participate in the advocacy day that we're having this Thursday, April 27th, and meet your constituents on the floor. For those of you in the audience who are community participants, again, participate in the Advocacy Day Thursday, 2 p.m. Wear blue in support of solidarity for mental health, and contact your elected officials to try to set up a little meeting with them on the floor that day. You can also stay informed with MHARI and NAMI Rhode Island through our social media and newsletters.
And here's contact information for NAMI Rhode Island and Beth's email address, as well as her general email inbox. And this is Mental Health Association's website and my email address. And we would love to invite you to participate at May is Mental Health Month again at the State House on Thursday, April 27th. The program begins at 2 o'clock and it ends around 3 o'clock or maybe just after 3 o'clock. And at that point, we'll encourage participants to meet their reps and senators on the House and Senate floors and talk about your lived experience, or if you're a provider, talk about your experience being a provider in Rhode Island. And we hope to see all of you there.
Lastly, we've built some time into the program today to address any questions or comments you all might have regarding the bills, the priority areas, or any other thing that we've addressed in the presentation. We encourage you to use either the hand raise feature of Zoom or to drop questions and comments into the chat. And I see that we already have one, which is, how can architects support these bills? Lori, do you have ideas?
I'm looking at the question, how can architects support these bills? Well, anyone can support these bills. Every one of us has a state representative and a state senator, and we all share the same governor. And these are the leaders who determine whether these pieces of legislation pass. They determine what's in the state budget, what's funded, what our priorities will be each year. And I encourage everyone to reach out to your state reps and senators. If you go to the Rhode Island Secretary of State's website, there's a place where you can put in your address and it will pull up your state officials, your rep, your senator, and also your congressmen. So I encourage everyone to do that. Any other questions?
I don't see any raised hands at the moment.
Someone's saying they've contacted legislators. Can you recommend sending emails or making phone calls that cover all of these bills at once, or is that overkill and the recipients might just ignore it? I don't think it's overkill, and I think it's okay to send one letter with all the bills that you care about. I think you would come across as looking very well informed, and that's very impressive. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint presentation if that's helpful, so you can have the bill numbers. And if you want, I'm happy to teach you how to, if you wanted to go to these bills and read them yourselves, I can give you the link for the state legislature's website. You put in the bill number and it pulls up the language of the bill and you can read it yourself.
I agree. I think that putting together a concise letter that says more or less that you're concerned about mental health and what legislation is up that'll impact mental health, and then just itemizing those bill numbers that are of importance can be equally as powerful as writing a letter regarding only one.
And I'll put the link to, this is the website where you can put in a bill number and it will pull it up, and you can download a copy of the bill if you wanted to download it and print it out.
I see another comment in chat that says the bill related to solitary confinement leads them to wonder what oversight will look like and how effective it will be, and if there's any more insight on that. So I can't speak to that specific to Rhode Island because we've not yet implemented it, but I can say that on the NAMI national website, NAMI.org, that is one of the policy priorities at a national level. And there's some data there about changes that they recommend to solitary confinement and the expected impacts based on previous studies and specific research. So that might be a good place for more data.
Mm-hmm. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that a really great group in Rhode Island called Open Doors was, I think, one of the authors of this piece of legislation. And I suspect that if these bills were to pass, that there would be some really great progressive forward-thinking recommendations that would come out of that oversight. And then, ideally, I think, the use of solitary confinement would be perhaps limited to just the most extremely violent prisoners, not people with SPMI who are in there for, quote, their own protection. Any other questions? I'm going to put the policy briefing in the chat for you to download if you want this PowerPoint. It is in the chat. You can click on it and download it to your computer so you have all the bill numbers. Oh, there's a question that just came in. How effective are petitions on a legislative level? Are there any that could be recommended for advocacy groups or advocacy groups? Well, I mean, I don't know if there's been a study per se where they've interviewed legislators or Congress people to say, what do you think of petitions? How effective are they? But I've heard anecdotally that legislators dismiss form letters that they get when you go to one of those petition sites, and every legislator gets the same exact email from a bunch of different people. They tend to think that I don't think that it counts as much as having a personal story from a real voter sharing, a unique experience with them or a unique point of view. I think they want to hear from you. They care about voters more than they care about organizations like Mental Health Association doing any advocacy. And so I encourage everyone to take the time to get to know your state rep and senator and share your stories with them and share your concerns with them. If your passion is ending the criminalization of mental illness, talk to them about why you feel that way. Talk to them about the research. They're human beings too. And I think, but for the most part, I think that they care about this stuff. They just need to hear from us.
Yeah, I would like to second that. I think we hear from legislators that the most effective way to advocate is absolutely to tell personal stories. And really a petition is a list, and it may not necessarily be a list of voters in their area or in their district, and it may not necessarily be real people. So it is more easily dismissed than hearing, so-and-so says such and such about their experience in this town or this city or this state. And we have a certain advocacy program with tools on how to tell those stories. Or you can participate in events like we're having on Thursday and have different one-on-ones. And that's not to take away from the possibility of advocating as a group, either by petition or any other means. It's just that those things are more impactful, and the memory of those conversations or reading that testimony is more lasting to legislators. And I saw a comment in the chat about how to know when to support legislation and when committees meet and so forth. So I dropped the link for the Rhode Island legislature page so you can follow the legislative calendar, which kind of addresses some of the answer to that question. Lori, did you want to add to that?
Not really. I mean, I would just add that there is a bill tracker that's on the General Assembly's website. And I have it set up so that all the bills I care about are tracked. And when there's a change in their status, for example, if they're going to be heard in a public hearing, they'll alert you, they'll send you an email. And that's the link, I believe. But let me know if that doesn't work. But that's how I stay informed. Is I get emails when my bills are being heard. And often in the with Mental Health Association, sometimes we'll alert our base when there are priority pieces of legislation being heard. For example, the Olmstead resolutions being heard Thursday night in Senate Health and Human Services. And I encourage anyone who cares about that to send an email, make a phone call, send a letter. I think letters are probably the most powerful, because if you submit a letter, if you email a letter, it gets scanned and placed on the General Assembly's website as part of the public record for that piece of legislation. And then when the committee, votes on that piece of legislation, if it comes to a vote, it doesn't always come to a vote, but if it comes to a vote, the members of that committee who heard the bill will go online and review what's in the public record, and they'll read through the letters that have been sent to them, and it will refresh their memory about, oh yeah, that's what's important about this, and yeah, that's the concern about this, and so letters, I think, are the most helpful. Any other questions? Well, my goodness, thank you so much for participating today. This is so wonderful that so many people are paying attention to mental and behavioral health policy. I don't think I could have imagined this maybe 3 years ago, that this many people would care, but I really appreciate your interest. Beth, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just that I hope I see all 60 some odd of you on Thursday
At the State House.
Yes, please join us at the State House Thursday at 2 o'clock. Be there. Talk to everyone soon. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.